Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You don't really notice the moment your family decides you're the supporting role in someone else's story. It happens in a slow drip. Not a single shattering moment, but 1,000 tiny ones that blur together until you realize you've spent your entire life sitting in the background, politely clapping for someone else's spotlight. For me, that realization didn't come in a dramatic scene or some big family meltdown. It came in whispers, in glances, in that condescending tone my father used when I spoke about my dreams, and most of all, in the way everyone around him echoed it without even noticing. From as far back as I can remember, my sister Sophia was the one they all adored. She was louder, prettier, shinier in that way that made people gravitate toward her even when she had nothing to say. She walked into a room like it was built just for her, and our parents fed that confidence like it was sacred. Every trophy she brought home was celebrated with dinners and speeches. Every time I accomplished something, my mother would pat my hand and say, "That's nice, sweetheart," while my father would ask why I hadn't done it sooner, or better, or louder. I got used to shrinking in the corners of family photos, standing just behind Sophia as they captured another moment of her being admired, another grin from our father as he raised a toast to his firstborn's achievements. When I graduated college early with honors, my father said, "That's good, but Sophia's communications degree is from a more prestigious school." When I bought my first home at 26, he said, "I hope the neighborhood's decent." But when Sophia rented a downtown loft with a roommate who played guitar at 2 in the morning, he called it independent and stylish. That was the pattern. My accomplishments were footnotes. Hers were headlines. I learned early not to expect too much from them, especially from him. He wasn't a cruel man in the way people usually mean when they say that. He didn't yell or hit or abandon. He just cut you in the small places, with offhand comments and sideways compliments and laughter that felt like it was aimed at your chest. That kind of damage doesn't leave bruises, it leaves questions that echo for years. So when I met Nolan, quiet, thoughtful Nolan, with his disarming smile and the kind of intelligence that didn't beg for attention, I didn't tell my parents right away. I didn't want their opinions poisoning what was still growing between us. And when he proposed, I didn't shout it from the rooftops or plan a social media spectacle. I simply said yes and let myself savor something for once, something that was mine, not measured by anyone else's expectations. Now the engagement party was just days away, and as I sat at another pre-party dinner at my parents' house, watching Sophia swirl her wine and describe the seating arrangements for her upcoming girls' trip, I felt that familiar burn of being invisible. But this time, it didn't sting the way it used to. Because this time, I knew something they didn't. My mother asked about Nolan with that vaguely interested tone she used when discussing my life, the kind that said she was asking out of obligation more than curiosity. I gave simple answers, not out of defiance, but because I knew whatever I said would be filtered through their usual lens, dismissed, dissected, or ignored altogether. And sure enough, when I mentioned Nolan's family was planning to attend the party, my father chuckled into his drink and leaned back in his chair like a man preparing to hold court. "Well, let's hope he's got better taste than your last one," he said, laughing harder than the line deserved. My mother chuckled politely. Sophia smiled like she was trying to decide if she should join in or play the good sister for a minute. I didn't react. I didn't frown. I didn't defend myself or explain that Nolan was nothing like my ex or that he wasn't some middle management placeholder waiting to fail upward. I just smiled slowly and took a sip of water, because I knew that in just a few days, they'd realize exactly who I was marrying. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to have to raise my voice to be heard. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't scream or bruise, it whispers, it lingers, it makes a home in your bones, and sets up shop behind your smile. It's the kind that comes not from insults hurled in anger, but from the kind delivered with a soft laugh, a raised eyebrow, a gentle pat on the hand that somehow stings worse than a slap ever could. That's how my family functions, never vicious enough to be called abusive, never kind enough to be called loving. Somewhere in between lies 1,000 polite wounds no one talks about, the kind that bleed beneath the surface while everyone clinks their glasses and pretends nothing's wrong. By the time my engagement party actually began, I was already prepared for the performance. I knew how this would play out, how my parents would smile just enough for the photos, how Sophia would act like she was thrilled for me while silently counting how many guests complimented her dress, how every meaningful moment would be punctuated with a casual remark that cut me just enough to remind me I was still second place in their eyes. It wasn't even a question anymore, it was tradition. The venue was beautiful, exactly how I'd envisioned it. Soft lights spilling across the terrace, elegant floral arrangements lining the tables, the kind of subtle elegance that never tried too hard but still left an impression. Nolan had insisted we keep it small but tasteful, just close family and friends, nothing over the top. That was his style, quiet sophistication, understated confidence. Of course, my family didn't see it that way. They saw the simplicity as a sign that I'd settled. Again. The first jab came before we even made it to the welcome toast. My mother pulled me aside to fix a strand of my hair and said, in that breathy tone she always used when she was about to say something meant to sound sweet but wasn't, "Your dress is lovely, dear." Though I must say, Sophia's gown is absolutely stunning. She really knows how to carry herself, doesn't she? I nodded politely, not because I agreed, but because I knew nothing I said would change the way she sees me. The compliment for me was always a preamble to praise for my sister. It always had been. Sophia, meanwhile, was floating around the room like it was her party, not mine, laughing too loudly, posing for pictures in the best lighting, making sure her presence was felt at every table. It was effortless, really. She'd mastered the art of being the center of attention without ever seeming like she demanded it. And everyone, including my parents, fell for it. Again. As the evening unfolded, so did the commentary. I caught my father leaning into one of his old golf buddies and saying, "Too bad Sophia didn't go first, she's the real catch." They both chuckled like it was harmless, like I wasn't standing less than 10 feet away, like I hadn't spent years learning to ignore that particular brand of backhanded cruelty. I smiled through it, just like I always had. But this time, I didn't smile out of submission. I smiled because I knew something they didn't, something that was about to wipe the smugness clean off their faces. Ever had your own family turn your happiest moments into subtle insults? Ever smiled through it while they treated you like background noise? Ever stood in your finest dress, next to the love of your life, while your own father whispered about how your sister would have made a better bride? Tell me I'm not the only one who's swallowed 1,000 polite humiliations just to keep the peace. Tell me I'm not alone in knowing that sometimes the cruelest things are said in the gentlest tones. I continued making rounds with Nolan, introducing him to a few distant relatives and listening as people asked him casual questions that barely scratched the surface of who he actually was. No one asked about his career, no one seemed to recognize his last name or even connect the dots between his quiet demeanor and the immense power he carried. They just assumed, because he wasn't flashing a Rolex or dominating the conversation, that he must be ordinary. Forgettable. Just another man who'd somehow stumbled into my life and, by their logic, probably wouldn't stick around long. Then came the final blow, or at least what my father thought would be. He raised his glass just before the dinner service started, tapping it lightly and flashing a grin that made my stomach twist. "Well," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "at least Sophia wouldn't marry a nobody." The room chuckled softly, that fake kind of laughter people give when they're not sure if they're supposed to find something funny or uncomfortable. My mother gave him a look that was half scolding, half amused. Sophia smirked behind her wine glass. I looked at Nolan, who simply smiled and squeezed my hand, calm as ever. But in that moment, I smiled too. Because they were seconds away from realizing exactly who they had just called a nobody. And my silence was about to become the loudest thing they'd ever hear. There's a strange kind of power in letting people underestimate you, in letting them believe they've figured you out when really, they're not even close. It's not always about playing the long game, but about knowing when to let the assumptions pile up just high enough that the crash becomes unforgettable. That night at my engagement party, I didn't have to say a single word to prove anyone wrong. I just had to let them keep talking, let them keep revealing how deeply they believed I would always be the lesser one, the unremarkable one, the one who somehow lucked her way into something decent, but never quite deserved more. By the time dessert service had begun and the second round of wine had started loosening people's tongues, I had heard enough to write a memoir of subtle insults and casual dismissal. My father, ever the king of backhanded commentary, launched into a story about a colleague's son who was finishing medical school, and then somehow managed to pivot into how Sophia had always set the bar when it came to relationships. He leaned toward my uncle, lowered his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, and said, we always thought Sophia would be the first to marry. She just has that polish, you know? She's always had better instincts. That word, instincts, rolled off his tongue with such smug finality it made my skin prickle. As if my relationship, my choices, and my future were all based on some naive accident of poor judgment, while Sophia's chaotic string of failed boyfriends and credit card maxing flings were somehow the gold standard for taste. But again, I said nothing. I simply nodded politely at whoever was speaking, smiled when I needed to, and let them keep painting their own distorted version of the story, one I knew would be shattered soon enough. My mother was no better, though her cruelty was more refined. She didn't speak poorly about Nolan outright, but she also never mentioned his name when people congratulated her. She'd smile and say, "Yes, we're so happy for Elena," then quickly pivot the conversation towards Sophia's recent promotion or the new designer bag Sophia had picked out for herself. It was subtle, deliberate, and exhausting, but expected. She had perfected the art of shining the light on Sophia while pretending she was being fair. Even the guests, many of whom I hadn't seen in years, followed the lead of my parents. They asked shallow questions about Nolan, where he grew up, what he did exactly, whether he had plans to pursue more visible work. One older cousin asked me point blank if I thought Nolan would ever really make something of himself, as if the man wasn't already one of the most respected biotech minds in the country, as if the quiet, unassuming presence he carried made him somehow lesser. It was fascinating, really, how deeply people equated confidence with flash, how deeply my family had been trained to see only what screamed for attention. The real kicker came in the form of Sophia herself. Somewhere between coffee service and another thinly veiled compliment, she cornered me in the bathroom, casually checking her lipstick in the mirror while delivering one of her classic poison-wrapped in pretty remarks. "Don't take it personally," she said, smoothing the hem of her dress and not even looking at me directly. "They just want what's best for you. You know how Dad is, he just worries. You've always been a little too trusting with men." She said it so softly, so casually, it could have passed as a sisterly concern if you didn't know her well. But I knew her. I knew exactly what she meant. I knew that she still believed she was the standard, the benchmark, the one who would always be viewed as the better daughter, even if she'd spent her 20s chasing men who couldn't spell fidelity and racking up debt she never intended to pay. I didn't bite. I didn't argue. I simply looked at her in the mirror, gave her the smallest smile, and replied, "You're right, Sophia. He does want what's best for me." Then I glanced at my watch. It was almost time. The second hand ticked forward, and I felt a slow, warm satisfaction settle in my chest. Perfect timing, I whispered to myself and walked out of the bathroom. Because the moment they'd all remember was just seconds away. There's something remarkably poetic about timing, about letting people build their assumptions just high enough that when the truth arrives, it doesn't need to shout, it simply walks in, dressed in elegance, wrapped in silence, and watched by every eye in the room because suddenly, no one can look away. That's the kind of power that doesn't need applause or grand entrances. It doesn't need noise, theatrics, or declarations. It walks quietly, but it changes everything the moment it appears. And in that moment, as the dessert plates were being placed gently in front of each guest, as forks clinked softly against fine china and the dull hum of small talk hovered in the air, I knew that moment had finally arrived. I didn't glance toward the door when I heard it open. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was about to unfold, and the anticipation in my chest wasn't anxiety, it was peace. The kind that comes when you know the story is about to turn and the people who doubted you are about to be silenced by nothing more than truth. The hush was immediate, subtle at first, like a slow ripple moving across still water. Heads began to turn, and the room's energy shifted in that sudden, invisible way that always happens when someone important walks in, not because they try to command attention, but because they simply carry too much gravity not to. Gerald and Margaret Whitmore didn't walk in like royalty. They didn't need to. They came in with that rare kind of quiet authority, the kind you recognize even if you don't know why. Gerald was dressed in a simple, tailored navy suit. Nothing flashy, no gold watch or designer logos, but every detail was perfect. Margaret wore a soft champagne-colored dress, minimal jewelry, her posture effortlessly graceful. They moved with the ease of people who had nothing to prove because their presence alone already said everything. Behind them, discreet but unmistakable, were two security staff in suits, lingering just far enough behind to be subtle, but close enough to remind anyone watching that this was not just some ordinary couple arriving late to a family gathering. My father, mid-sip of his whiskey, glanced toward the door and froze. His eyes flicked from Gerald to Margaret to the men standing behind them, and I saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His grip on the glass faltered, his throat tightened, and a single cough escaped, sharp and uncontrolled, sending a splash of amber liquid across the white tablecloth. It wasn't dramatic, not loud enough to cause alarm, but enough for several heads to turn and enough for Sophia to shoot him a startled look. Before anyone could fill the silence, Gerald stepped forward with the warm, confident smile of a man who had been in 1,000 rooms more intimidating than this one and never once felt out of place. He raised his glass slightly and said, in his calm, articulate voice, "We're absolutely thrilled to welcome Elena into our family. She's everything we hoped our son would find in a partner, grounded, intelligent, gracious, and strong." You could hear the fork drop 3 tables over. My mother sat up straighter in her seat, her smile frozen halfway between polite interest and stunned confusion. Sophia blinked slowly, her brows tightening as her eyes darted toward me, then back to Gerald. Even some of the distant relatives, the ones who had spent the evening whispering assumptions about Nolan's job and whether he'd ever be able to support a family, now sat in stiff silence, unsure how to respond to the presence of a couple whose very existence challenged everything they had assumed about this engagement. And then it happened, one of the most satisfying moments I'd ever witnessed in my life. Sophia's boyfriend, a hedge fund analyst who prided himself on his financial literacy but lacked even a shred of emotional intelligence, squinted across the room and leaned towards Sophia. His voice wasn't quiet enough, not in a room this still. "Wait," he stammered, staring at Gerald with wide eyes. That's the Whitmore? As in Whitmore Industries? The ones behind the Biomedical Research Consortium. I turned to look at him just long enough to catch the growing panic in his voice, then glanced back at Sophia, who was now visibly pale, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. Her posture stiffened as her hands gripped the edge of her napkin, twisting it beneath the table. I didn't say a word. I just smiled and slowly lifted my wine glass, taking the most graceful sip I could manage, letting the moment stretch just long enough for every person at that table to understand exactly what had just happened. They hadn't just misjudged me. They had misjudged everything. There's a kind of power in choosing silence, not because you're weak or passive, but because you know the truth speaks louder than any speech you could give, any defense you could mount, any attempt to justify yourself to people who never truly saw you in the first place. That night, as the air inside the venue grew heavier with tension disguised as politeness and curiosity disguised as sudden interest, I stood at the center of it all, smiling with ease, not because I wanted their approval, but because I no longer needed it. After Gerald's simple yet seismic introduction, the rest of the room began to shift its tone like a flock of birds realizing they'd been flying in the wrong direction. Suddenly, my name was being said with a different kind of weight, not as a footnote or an obligation, but as something worth acknowledging. Family friends who hadn't looked twice at Nolan now hovered nearby with shallow questions wrapped in over-friendly tones, trying to recover the dignity they'd unknowingly dropped on the floor. My mother, usually composed to the point of frost, kept glancing between me and Gerald like she was still trying to piece together how the daughter she'd always treated as a delicate inconvenience had somehow become the centerpiece of a family alliance powerful enough to silence a room. I didn't gloat, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy watching them squirm just a little. I simply accepted the congratulations that came my way with the same kind of grace I had always offered in return for their condescension. But this time, my smile wasn't a shield, it was a mirror. And as each of them looked into it, they had no choice but to see the version of me they had never bothered to notice before. The accomplished woman. The self-assured daughter. The woman who didn't need to prove herself, but had still done it anyway. Nolan moved beside me with his usual quiet strength, offering a hand here, a kind word there, never needing to dominate a single conversation, yet somehow commanding more respect in his silence than any of them had managed with all their noise. It was his mother, Margaret, who delivered the final blow without even realizing it, or maybe she did, and that was the brilliance of it. She was standing beside me as another distant cousin awkwardly complimented my engagement ring, likely realizing a little too late that it was worth more than the down payment on her house, when Margaret leaned in just slightly and said, not loudly, but clearly enough for anyone within earshot, "We're lucky to have Elena. Truly, she's the best part of this union." There was no malice in her voice, no smugness, just simple truth, delivered with the kind of sincerity my own family had never been capable of offering me. And in that moment, every strained smile and fake toast I'd endured over the years felt like it had been answered without me lifting a finger. Sophia, of course, was seething. I saw it in the way her laughter had gone flat, in the way she sat stiffer than usual, her wine glass refilled a little too frequently, her compliments just slightly out of rhythm. She hadn't spoken to me directly since the Whitmores had arrived, and I knew she was recalculating everything in her head, trying to reframe the narrative in a way that still left her on top. But there was no saving it. Not this time. My father, on the other hand, had gone from smug to pale to desperate in under an hour. He kept trying to insert himself into conversations, dropping lines about how he knew there was something special about Nolan, though he hadn't even remembered his name 2 hours earlier. He laughed too loudly at Gerald's casual comments, offered clumsy anecdotes from my childhood that were more about himself than me, and occasionally glanced in my direction with that half-forced smile he reserved for moments when he realized he'd overplayed his hand and was trying to recover what little dignity remained. Eventually, when most guests had moved toward the outdoor patio, he cornered me by the bar, his expression trying too hard to be casual, his drink clutched a little tighter than usual. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, the kind of tone he used when he felt like he was owed something. "Why didn't you say who he was?" I looked at him for a long moment, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted him to sit in the silence long enough to realize just how ridiculous the question was. Then I leaned in slightly, smiled politely, and said, "Would you have cared if he wasn't rich?" His face didn't fall completely, but it cracked, just enough for me to see that the truth had landed exactly where it needed to. And I didn't wait for his answer, because deep down, we both already knew it. There's something strangely quiet about walking away from the very people who spent years pretending you were invisible, something almost peaceful about leaving them standing in the ruins of the version of you they built in their own heads. That night, as the last notes of soft music drifted into the cool air and guests began slipping into their coats, I stood by the doorway, hand in hand with Nolan, watching the scene settle like dust in an empty theater after a performance no one expected to be so unforgettable. There was no grand exit, no dramatic farewell, no final mic drop, just the unmistakable shift in power that lingers long after the spotlight moves. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud because it already changed everything the moment the truth walked in uninvited and took its seat at the table. We said our goodbyes with quiet smiles and polite grace, thanking guests who now wore expressions of apology wrapped in small talk, congratulations laced with discomfort, and questions they were too embarrassed to ask. I could see it in their eyes, that dawning realization, that uncomfortable weight of having underestimated someone for so long that they now didn't know how to look her in the face without wondering how many other things they'd gotten wrong. My mother hugged me tighter than usual, her voice softer, less performative, as if she was trying to rewrite a decade of emotional neglect in one embrace. It was too late for that, but I let her have it anyway, because not every wound needs revenge. Some just need distance. Sophia stayed seated near the far end of the patio, legs crossed, face carefully composed, but her silence said more than any words could have. She barely glanced my way, pretending to be absorbed in her phone, but I could feel her frustration in the way her shoulders held tension like armor, in the way her glass stayed full but untouched, in the way her boyfriend kept shifting uncomfortably beside her, as though still reeling from the accidental revelation that had shattered their sense of superiority. She wasn't angry because I'd succeeded, she was angry because she hadn't seen it coming. That was the part that would haunt her. Not that I had found someone extraordinary, not that I had been embraced by a family more powerful and dignified than ours could ever pretend to be, but that she had genuinely believed I was incapable of something more. And maybe that's the part that always cut deepest, that they all saw me as someone who would always fall short, someone who would always settle for less, someone who didn't have the fire to rise beyond their shallow expectations. They built a version of me they could manage, someone small enough to dismiss, someone convenient to compare. And for a long time, I played my part. I stayed quiet, stayed agreeable, stayed out of the way. I let them believe I was content with scraps while they handed each other the best pieces of the table. But what they never understood is that I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I was watching, learning, waiting. And now I wasn't waiting anymore. Nolan squeezed my hand as we stepped outside, and I glanced up at him, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to see his face in that moment, the man who had never once asked me to prove my worth. The man who had never treated me like I was trying to catch up to someone else's spotlight, the man who saw me, not in relation to who my sister was or how my father measured success, but for who I was when no one else was looking. That kind of love doesn't need noise. It doesn't need fanfare or validation. It just exists, steady and strong, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to fight for my place in the story. I had written it myself. As we walked to the car, I let the night wrap around me like a quiet goodbye to an old version of myself I no longer owed anything to. I didn't feel triumphant in the way people expect when they talk about revenge. I didn't feel victorious or smug or even angry anymore. What I felt was freedom, freedom from trying to be seen by people who only ever saw their own reflections, freedom from chasing approval from a family that mistook cruelty for tradition, and most of all, freedom to stand exactly as I was, without apology or explanation. I'm not sure they'll ever admit they were wrong. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is they saw me. Finally. She thought I'd always be the afterthought. But the truth is, I was just waiting for the right moment to stop pretending I was small.